Welcome to session 5 of Rereading the Bible for LGBTQ inclusion. As we have already seen in looking at the broader historical and cultural context, the church really has a responsibility to evaluate and to be clear about our interactions and intentions towards the LGBTQ community in our modern day. And so in this study, we've been looking at the Bible and how to develop a good historical contextual hermeneutic to try to understand the biblical story in its original historical setting so that we can properly apply it to our own context today. We saw this first last week with Genesis chapter 19 and its parallel in Judges chapter 19. And in these passages, we saw how men were exerting themselves in a way to demoralize and shame other men, and how the emphasis was placed upon showing hospitality towards those who were staying within one's home. And that we too have a responsibility to be caring towards those who are around us. This takes us to two additional passages that are sometimes weaponized against the queer community, and that is Leviticus chapter 18 verse 22 and Leviticus chapter 20 verse 13. To help us to gain the perspective of what's going on in Leviticus, we need to first turn back to the book of Exodus. And you'll recall that Exodus tells us that Moses led the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt across the Sea of Reeds and to Mount Sinai. Now, scholars continue to debate the time in which this occurs. Is it the 15th century or the 13th century? And how you evaluate the external and internal biblical evidence will reach you to a place of trying to identify one of these time frames in the events that follow. But regardless of when you date the Exodus, even the route in which the Hebrews took is much debated and not real clear to us at this present time in our understanding of the biblical history. So they could have followed any number of routes, and it's explained to us in Exodus chapter 19 verses 1 through 2 that on the first day of the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai, and after they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. And so you can see on the map some of the different identifications of possible routes that they would have taken and possible locations where Mount Sinai would have been at the time that Moses receives God's instructions. And these instructions come in the form of 613 laws that are given to the people to help provide some governance on how they're to interact with each other and how they're best to relate and worship God. And much of that includes the 10 commandments that occur in Exodus chapter 20, other general laws that are given from Exodus 21 through 24, the instructions on how the tabernacle is to be formed and used in worship in Exodus 25 through 40. And then the book of Leviticus gives us an invitation into the lives of the Levitical priests and what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to serve. Now, also in the Torah is the book of Genesis, which gives an origin story of how humanity came into being and how the nation of Israel came into being through Abraham and his descendants. In addition, we learn in the book of Numbers the chronicling of their journey through the wilderness and towards the land of promise. And then Deuteronomy serves as a second giving of the law or reiteration of the law as the people prepare to walk into the land that has been promised to their ancestor Abraham. And so this Torah, this original part of the Old Testament, this foundation, serves as a guide to help us to see what life was like, what the culture was like in the ancient Near Eastern world. Today, we're going to focus on the content of the book of Leviticus. And Leviticus shows us how the Hebrews live in relationship with their Creator and their Deliverer. And it's broken down in a chiastic-like structure, meaning that it points towards the center with parallels on each side. So sacrifices and rituals are described in chapters 1 through 7, and again at the end of the book in chapters 23 through 27. Emphasis is placed upon the priests and what they are to do and how they're to serve God in chapters 8 through 10, and again near the end in chapters 21 and 22. More germane to what we'll be focusing on are the distinct practices or purity laws that are listed both in chapters 11 through 15 and chapters 18 through 20. And then that center section, which is the point of the middle of the structure, is an emphasis upon Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, this day of the Lord in which the people are to experience a reunification in their relationship with God. And this is in the center chapters of chapter 16 and 17. Today, we'll focus on the second section of the distinct practices and purity laws, because it's in these chapters, chapters 18 through 20, that we find the two references that speak to same-sex relationships. The distinct practices and purity laws in the first section, in chapter 11, deal with food that they were to eat or ingest, or the foods that they were to reject and not eat. Chapter 12, which speaks about how they're supposed to respond in the birthing process, what a woman is to do to cleanse herself if she gives birth to a son or to a daughter. And then in chapters 13 and 14, there's a number of prescriptions about how a person is to respond if they have a skin disease of some kind, and the process to be reacclimated into society through identification that they've been cleansed or healed. And then chapter 15 speaks about bodily discharges, both of men and of women, and the impurity that that brings and how they're supposed to handle these circumstances. So all of these chapters, chapters 11 through 15, all deal with purity laws. Sometimes people call it holiness codes, or distinct practices of how the Hebrew people are supposed to respond to these adverse circumstances. Now, our focus is not on these chapters, but rather on the chapters in the second section of purity laws, which are chapters 18 through 20. Chapter 18, as we'll soon see, focuses on impurity from sexual relationships, improper sexual interaction with other people. Chapter 19, which we'll kind of skim over, focuses on impurity in other types of relationships and really has a lot of correlations to the Ten Commandments and how we're to treat one another as a reflection of our devotion to God. And then chapter 20 in many ways mirrors chapter 18 and really emphasizes the importance but also the consequences of violating these purity laws. Our focus is going to be on chapters 18 and 20. So let's dive in first to Leviticus chapter 18. The chapter begins with these words. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord." Now you see in this introductory section that there is an emphasis upon relationship. That as the people of God stay in union with God, committed to their covenant relationship with God, they're going to live distinctively from the behavioral practices and the worship practices of the people that they have come from in Egypt and the people they are going into in the land of Canaan. Or said a little differently, they are to love God by living distinct from Egyptian and Canaanite worship practices, as verses 1 and 2 of Leviticus 18 states, and they are to love others by living distinct from Egyptian and Canaanite behaviors, as stated in verse 3. And then verses 4 and 5 summarize that as they obey God's laws, as they obey these teachings and guidelines, they will experience long and fulfilling life. So this is the essence of what these chapters are all about. Now, as you dive further into chapter 18, you see that verse 6 states kind of a thesis statement. Leviticus 18:6 says, "No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord." Now, I'm going to summarize some of these passages, but you can see this as an overarching theme statement. Because verse 7 talks about how a man is not to have sex with his mother. Verse 8, a man is not to have sex with any of his father's other wives. Verse 9, he's not to have sex with a full-blooded sister or a half-sister. Verse 10, he's not to have sexual relations with a granddaughter. And verse 11, he's not to have sex with a stepsister. Then, if you continue on in the chapter, you see that in verses 12, 13, and 14, they're all prohibitions against different versions of aunts. Whether it's a father's sister, mother's sister, or father's brother's wife, he was not to have sex with any of these people. And then verse 15, he's not to have sex with his daughter-in-law. In verse 16, or his sister-in-law. Then as you move into verses 17 and 18, it further emphasizes that a man is not to have sex both with a woman and either her daughter or granddaughter. And verse 18, he's not to have sex with his wife's sister as long as his wife is still living. Afterwards, he can have a sexual relationship with her. Now, this certainly is different than the story that we read of Jacob, who had two sisters who were his wives. After this, in verses 19 through 23, we see a broadening of the umbrella here, that it's not just about how a man is not to have sex with different family members, but it has a broader inclusivity. Verse 19 says that a man is not to have sex with a woman during her menstruation, even if it's his wife. In verse 20, he is not to have sex with a neighbor's wife, and this is probably for tribal purposes. So this is a literal interpretation of neighbor, not like we think of it in New Testament times where Jesus tells us to love our neighbor, and this is to include all people. But this is likely to be a reference to having sex with someone who lives nearby, because in those days families lived near each other, and it's likely that this person was a part of the same tribe and perhaps even extended part of the same family. Then in addition to that, verse 21, he's to avoid child sacrifice, which was a part of pagan worship practices, especially in Canaan. Verse 22 is the prohibition of male with male sex that we'll look at more in detail today. And then verse 23, that whether it's a man or a woman, they were not to have sex with an animal. So all of these are further prescriptions of what the people were not to do. And the primary reason, going back to the opening verses of the chapter, is that these were part of pagan rituals in the neighboring nations around them. And to be distinctive, they were not to participate in the same types of worship practices or lifestyle practices that would cause people to have confusion over who it is that they were actually worshiping. Then we come to the conclusion of Leviticus 18 that reads in verses 24 through 30, "Do not defile yourself in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Everyone who does any of these detestable things, such persons must be cut off from their people. Keep my requirements and do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you. came, and do not defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God. So again, it seems clear both from the introduction and mirrored here in the conclusion that the Hebrew people were to not follow the practices of the other nations around them, especially the Egyptians, where they have come from out of slavery, and the Canaanites, where they're going into in the promised land. They're to continue to love God, living distinctly from the Egyptian and Canaanite behavioral practices, as stated here in verses 24 through 29 of Leviticus 18, echoing the introduction. And they're to love God, living distinct from the Egyptian and Canaanite worship practices, as echoed again here in verse 30, much like the introduction. So as long as they obey the laws, they will live in the land. But if they break these laws, then they will also be defiling the land and be vomited up out of it. They will be cast out of it. And so the emphasis is clear that this is the intent of this chapter. Now let's hone in on verse 22, because this is the focal point of the verse that in this chapter that is oftentimes used to talk about the practices of homosexuality. Leviticus 18:22 states, "Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. This is detestable." So at first reading, this verse seems to condemn any male with male sexual act and describes it as detestable. Now, before we break that down, let's go ahead and look at chapter 20, because it's important to take these two verses in the same context and look at them together. Leviticus chapter 20, verses 1 through 5, talks about the practice of child sacrifice, a practice that seems to at least have some practice and commonality among the Canaanites, and at times is incorporated into Hebrew practice throughout their history. Verse 5 summarizes, "I myself will set my face against him and his family, and will cut them off from their people, together with all who follow him, in prostituting themselves to Molech." If you were at our Ash Wednesday service, I made the case that Molech here is probably not a Canaanite god that's being worshipped, but instead the practice of child sacrifice. And the offering of a child as a sacrifice to the gods is not the way of Yahweh. Yahweh is unlike the other gods of the ancient Near Eastern world. He cares for us rather than selfishly cares for himself. And so the thought of offering another person, let alone a child, to God is anathema. It was unheard of. It was unacceptable. This sets the stage then for what is to happen throughout the rest of the chapter. So much like we see the introduction and conclusion of chapter 18 serving as bookends, formulating the intent of what is happening in between, in the same way we see that happening here in chapter 20. The Israelite people will incorporate child sacrifice, they will fall away from being faithful to God, and they will be vomited out of the land, or they will be cut off, as it says here, because of their prostitution. This is not about prostitution in its literal sense, but metaphorically, their unfaithfulness to God. Their adulterous relationship by incorporating these foreign practices from the nations around them rather than staying loyal to the character of God. And so the Assyrians come into the northern kingdom in 721, and then the Babylonians come and attack Judah in 587, and the land is destroyed. The people are taken into exile. This all comes to fulfillment. Now, as we look at the rest of chapter 20, we see a lot of similar parallels to chapter 18. So let me run through the remainder of the chapter verse by verse in summary fashion. In verse 6, the use of mediums or spirituses, wizards, to try to elicit spiritual power is condemned. Then in verse 7 and 8, there is a reiteration of the importance of being holy in a way that mirrors God's holiness. Holiness means set apart. So the intent here is not that we are to be so like God that we're set apart from our humanity, but rather that we live in relation with God in a way that's distinctive from the ways that other nations and their people worshiped their deities. To be holy. Verse 9. It is prohibited that a person curse their parents. Verse 10, it's prohibited to commit adultery. These are parts of that original 10 of God's commandments that he gave to the people. And then in verse 11, it's restated that sex with one's father's wife was prohibited. Continuing on, verse 12, a man was not to have sex with his daughter-in-law. Verse 13, which will be the focus of what we look at tonight, is the prohibition of a male with male sex. Verse 14, sex with a woman and with that woman's mother was prohibited. Verses 15 and 16 reiterate that sex with animals is prohibited. Verse 17 restates that sex with one's sister is a violation of God's laws. Then in verse 18, we see having sex with menstruation being prohibited. Verse 19 reiterates sex with your sister is prohibited. Verse 20, sex with an aunt is prohibited. Verse 21, sex with your sister-in-law is not acceptable. And then verses 22 through 24 kind of bring in this further allusion, much like verses 7 and 8 did in the opening section, to emphasize the importance. And the importance here is to follow these laws. Then verse 25 concludes with a reiteration going all the way back to chapter 11 about the importance of following the dietary restrictions that the people have. And this leads us to our conclusion of the chapter in verse 26. You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy. And I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. So again, in summary fashion, I think we can accurately state that these chapters of chapter 20 and chapter 18, both emphasize the importance of not complying with the practices and the worship styles of the nations around them, but instead to stay focused on God and to treat people in a way that honors God. So in summary, verses 22 through 25 here emphasize loving others in a distinctive way from the Canaanite and Egyptian behavioral practices. And in verse 26, to love God by living distinctively from the Egyptian and Canaanite worship practices. And as the people obey these laws, they will live long in the land. Now this takes us to dive deeper into verse 13, which is the verse of this chapter that mirrors the verse of chapter 18 that talks about male with male relationships. So let's look at that verse more closely. If a man has sexual relations with a man, as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. So we see here, unlike the previous version in chapter 18, that not only is it condemned as a practice, but it is also stated to be a capital offense. The death penalty is to be enacted against both men who have male-to-male sexual relations. So the traditionalist who says we want to hold on to traditional Christian and cultural attitudes and practices towards things, such as biblical interpretation, church practices, cultural attitudes, and state and national laws, comes to this passage, and they hold that the Old Testament prescribes the death penalty for men lying with men as with women, citing these two references, Leviticus 18:22 and 20 verse 13. And regardless of whether a modern day follower of God looks at this passage and says, yes, it should be a capital offense and the death penalty should be enacted, or they extend some grace on the consequence, they still identify male with male sexual relations to be condemned in these two verses and therefore they're considered an abomination or a detestable practice by the homosexual community, and it cannot be tolerated or endorsed by Bible-believing followers of Jesus. But as we saw last week, we need to dive deeper in trying to understand the historical contextual hermeneutic to which we approach the scripture and see if there might be alternative ways to understand what's happening here. We also saw last week that the Hebrew word toevah is used 117 times in the Old Testament. 5 times in Leviticus chapter 18, verses 22, 26, 27, 29, and 30, and 1 time in Leviticus 20, verse 13. So in both passages that we're looking at today, this term is used. But we also saw last week that in Ezekiel 49, which elaborates on the sin of Sodom, that it speaks about these toevah behaviors. And when we looked at the broader context of Ezekiel, we saw that the 40 references in Ezekiel predominantly use this term to talk about the adulterous activities of the Hebrew people not being faithful and loyal to God. So the question then becomes, what is detestable or an abomination? And what fits contextually with the story or the line in which it's used? We've already made, I think, a pretty convincing case that both chapters 18 and 20 are emphasizing that the Hebrew people are not to live the way the Egyptians or the Canaanites live, and they're not to worship in the ways that the Egyptians and the Canaanites live. And if they do, they are not being faithful to God, and they're going to be banished from the land that they're promised. And so this seems to fit extremely well with how Ezekiel uses the term to talk about things that are not acceptable, that show a lack of loyalty and commitment to the covenant between God and his people. Let's look at a couple of other references where toevah is used. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, the term is used about eating pork, rabbit, shellfish, and eating animals that are already dead. In Ezekiel chapter 22, the term is used to speak about mistreating one's parents or aliens, orphans or widows. In Proverbs chapter 6, verses 15 through 17, toevah is used to speak about having haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run to do evil, and a false witness, or one who sows discord. In Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 13, specifically, we read, "He lends at interest and takes a profit. Will such a man live? He will not, because he has done all these detestable things, toevah. He is to be put to death. His blood will be on his own head." So we see a myriad of different references to toevah, meaning different specific practices, all the way from having prideful eyes and feet that are swift to go do something that's evil. But here in Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 13, it's being used to talk about lending money to someone and charging them interest for it. And this is not only toevah, but it carries with it the penalty of capital punishment. They are to be put to death. So as we saw last week, if we really look at the biblical text and we consider its impact upon our own lives, we're all sodomites. But I think here we can further see that we have all committed toevah in one way or another. Phyllis Bird says, "Toevah is not an ethical term, but a term of boundary marking with a basic sense of taboo." It's setting a boundary. It's saying this is my responsibility, but not beyond this. So for the Hebrew people, they were responsible for their own actions. They were responsible for their own worship practices. They were responsible for how they engaged with each other and with God. They were not responsible for the behaviors of the Egyptians. They were not responsible for the behavior of the Canaanites. God would deal with each person and each group individually. But instead of us getting so haughty that we look down upon others, we need to take care of what's going on in our own lives. That's what the Old Testament scholar Phyllis Bird is saying here. This term is really a term about demarcation of the line. You need to take care of what's going on inside of you and make sure that you are worshiping God wholeheartedly, that you are serving His people, you are taking care of others, you are living out His attributes in relation with people around you. This is what leads to prosperity, and the absence of this is what leads to being removed from the land, removed from the provision, removed from the life of blessing and fulfillment. Matthew Vines, perhaps the leading scholar in queer theology, says of this, quote, "Male same-sex intercourse was prohibited in Leviticus because it was regarded as uniquely degrading for a man to be treated like a woman in a deeply patriarchal society." We saw this last week both in Genesis chapter 19 and in Judges chapter 19. In both cases, it was men trying to rape and harm other men that was the condemned practice. And their efforts to do so was not to show hospitality or care to welcoming these strangers who were among them, but the opposite, to degrade them, to shame them, to ostracize them in a way that was harmful in a world in which men were elevated in society and women were oftentimes looked at as far less of human beings than men. And so I think Vines really helps us here to understand what's going on, not only in Genesis, but now as we look at these two verses in Leviticus. So I want to encourage you to pause the video here and take a few minutes and consider this question. What is detestable or an abomination? Is it the specific act or is it pagan worship? And then secondly, what does an abomination mean to you? Take a few minutes, reflect on those questions, maybe take some time to journal your responses or talk among yourselves with family members or those in your small group, and pause the video, take a little break, stretch your legs, take a few minutes, get you something to drink, and then come back and we're going to dive in a little deeper into what's happening in these passages and look at the broader context. So, what is detestable or an abomination, and what does abomination mean to you? If you're following along in our book study with David Gushee, you can relate perhaps to these words that are in our chapter on Leviticus. Gushee says, "It is relevant to note that never again outside of Leviticus are same-sex acts mentioned in the Old Testament law, leaving at least 111 of the 117 uses of the term, quote, abomination, to describe other issues. It is interesting how few of those other acts or character qualities are ever described as abominations by Christians today." So again, I think for me, the importance here is not giving me some weapon to use scripture to attack other people, but rather to look at what it means to my life and how I can best strive to live in right relation with God and with other people. I want to take some time to look at the significance here of the emphasis upon capital punishment, and to do so in rather broad terms as it applies throughout the books of the law, and in particular Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So listen to all of these things that are said in Exodus to deserve capital punishment or death as a result of inappropriate activity. If someone touches Mount Sinai while God is present, Exodus chapter 21 verse 12 says that they are to be put to death. If someone strikes their parents, Exodus 21:15 says they are to be killed. Similarly, if they curse their parents, Exodus 21:29 says they are to be executed. If someone is caught kidnapping another person, Exodus 21 verse 17 says that they are to be put to death. If someone has an animal that attacks a person and that animal is not restrained, Exodus 22 verse 19 says they're to be put to death. Again, as we saw earlier, bestiality is condemned and worthy of execution in Exodus 31:14, and even breaking the Sabbath laws, which we see Jesus contesting throughout his ministry, is condemned to capital punishment in Exodus chapter 31, verse 15. And then, as we've already summarized, Leviticus also mentions numerous things that require the death penalty, including child sacrifice in Leviticus 20, verse 2, cursing one's parents in chapter 20, verse 9, incest with family members in many different ways in Leviticus 20, verses 11 through 15, being a medium or a wizard, according to Leviticus 20, verse 27, blaspheming God's name or saying God's name in vain, Leviticus 24:17, committing murder, Leviticus 24:21, and anything that is devoted to God as a result of being in war, even down to the livestock, is to be killed according to Leviticus 27:29. In the book of Numbers, we see these other things listed as being the necessary resulting in the capital punishment. If a non-Levite approaches the tabernacle in Numbers 3:10, if someone other than Moses, Aaron, or Aaron's sons camp in front of the tabernacle according to Numbers 3:38, if an outsider, someone who's not an Israelite, comes near the altar in Numbers 18 verse 7, they are to be killed. And if someone strikes another person and that person ultimately dies as a result of the attack, that person who has perpetrated the other is to be put to death according to Numbers 35 verses 16 through 21. In addition, the book of Deuteronomy lists that any divination or trying to consult with spirits through dreams in Deuteronomy 13, 1 through 5 is to be put to death. Enticing someone to idol worship is a capital offense according to Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 11. Towns where idol worship took place were to be completely destroyed according to Deuteronomy 13, 12 through 18. And children, again, who disobey their parents are to be put to death according to Deuteronomy 21, 18 through 21. Now, I run through this list just to show that this is not just male with male sex that is condemned according to Leviticus 20 as worthy of capital punishment. There's many examples throughout the Torah in which someone is to be put to death for doing something, and some of those things are things that you and I find ourselves at times doing. So, do you believe that the things listed as capital offenses in the Old Testament law should still require the death penalty? Take a moment, reflect on that, talk about it among yourselves, and then we'll come back and continue to reflect together. I think as we wrestle with these passages, especially of the Old Testament and the Old Testament law that deal with things that are not comparable parallels to our own time, we have to ask ourselves, much like we do the New Testament letters of Paul, what is our takeaway? And for me, there is a differentiation between practice and principle. If the specific practice of male with male sex is the impure act, then any and all male with male sex would be impure. But if the general principle of worshiping other gods is what is impure, which in ancient Canaanite practice included male with male sex, then the greater principle is that people should remain faithful to God in their particular context, regardless of the specific practice. So to me, consistency really matters. And consistency requires a hermeneutic that applies one's approach to this particular purity law and all the other purity laws. Followers of God are called to resist social, cultural, and religious practices that do not parallel the principles of the character of the God that we serve. So it seems that such consistency is better derived when we apply the overarching and more general principle behind the specific cultural practices rather than seeking to infuse the practices of ancient Eastern society to our modern Western society. We are to resist adopting behavior that contradicts God's character and determining that for us necessitates a personal relationship with God. We're to love God and love others. And if that is our filter of how we are to live, then we strive to do that the best of our ability, even when it necessitates standing or kneeling against cultural norms. So this picture on the screen dates back to the very first time that Colin Kaepernick knelt in a professional football game during the national anthem. I was having lunch with a friend this week, and he shared about how this helped him to better understand the Levitical passages that we focused our time on together tonight. That it's standing up against the things that are happening around him. And for Kaepernick, that was police brutality that was happening especially against Black Americans and other minorities. And Kaepernick wanted to have some civil way to say, I am not supporting that behavior. Now, this was a huge risk for him, and it had tremendous consequences on his career. But for him, it was worth taking such a stand. And this calls us to reflect on what is our form of resistance to allowing cultural behaviors around us to draw us in to participation in ways that violates our distinctive walk with God. We too need to take a stand to live out the character of God in the way that he calls and compels us, in whatever way you evaluate these passages that we are looking at in this study. So how does your view of Old Testament law as a follower of Jesus and the new covenant we have in him? How do you view it? And then secondly, how do you reconcile the socially acceptable and religious permissible practices of today that violate the literal reading of the Old Testament law? So take a couple of minutes, pause the video, and give reflection to these questions. Jot down some notes or share them among those who are with you. Now, as we did last week, I want to try to use the New Testament as a means to help us to better understand the Old Testament. In approximately CE 49, the church debated the inclusion of non-Jews into the followers of the way of Jesus. This occurred at the Jerusalem Council that concluded that Gentiles did not have to conform to the law's requirements to be followers of Jesus. So Jesus died somewhere around 35 CE, and so we're talking about another 15 years later. The church is still in its infancy. And as the church begins to grow from Pentecost, when the disciples went to the temple and thousands of people converted, and from that the apostles went out to the neighboring areas of Samaria and beyond and took the gospel message. And then when Paul was converted, he took the message even further into Gentile territory and throughout the Greco-Roman world. And so as the gospel continued to expand beyond its Jewish center to the Gentile periphery, more and more the question arose on how Gentiles could become followers of Jesus. Did they need to become Jewish proselytes in order to follow Jesus? And Peter, although he originally was oppositional to Gentiles coming to Christianity without becoming Jews, he changes his mind, and in Acts chapter 15, verses 10 and 11, he says, "Now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of Gentiles a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors have been able to bear? No, we believe it is through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved just as they are." And so Peter had this tremendous experience with Cornelius, a Roman soldier, and seeing that the same spirit was upon him that had been on them. And he changed his mind. He was open to a different perspective. And that's what we've been wrestling with through this study. Can we change our mind? Can we look at things differently than how we looked at them before? And what does that mean for Gentile inclusion? Well, the council there in Jerusalem in approximately AD 49, they came to this consensus. Gentiles do not have to convert to Judaism in order to become followers of the way of Jesus. But Gentiles were asked to build collaboration through these following behaviors. They were to abstain from food polluted by idols. They were to abstain from sexual immorality. They were to abstain from eating the meat of strangled animals, and they were to abstain from blood. So in an effort to try to build harmony and union, Gentiles were asked to participate in collaborating in these 4 ways. Now, Paul continues to debate these, and he writes about, for example, that it's just meat that's being offered to an idol that doesn't really exist, so it doesn't really matter whether, but he talks about the importance of not being a stumbling block to those around you. And so Paul's still wrestling with a lot of these points, but his primary goal is to try to help the believers to focus on the needs of other people and honoring God in their choices rather than whatever they're permissible to be able to do. But the one that speaks most pertinently to us in our context of what we're looking at in Leviticus is that second principle guideline, to abstain from sexual immorality. The term that's translated here in Acts 15:20 as sexual immorality is the Greek word porneia. It's a term that we use to get the word pornography today. This term is used 25 times in the New Testament, and it refers throughout in a wide array of sexual improprieties that include everything from being wrongfully married to having ancestral relationships and to metaphorically being unfaithful to God. So this wide array of sexual behaviors is not specifically speaking or exclusively speaking of male with male sex like we've seen mentioned in Leviticus. In fact, the linguistic scholar Zohaitis explains, quote, "Symbolically, porneia stands for idolatry, the forsaking of the true God in order to worship idols. Since God is said to be married to his church through Christ, then any idolatry is unfaithfulness to one's married partner." Zohaitis says this in the Complete Word Study Dictionary of the New Testament. So for Zohaitis, this term, porneia, goes all the way back to what we've been alluding to in Leviticus, that the believers in the church after the Council of Jerusalem, who were Gentiles, should be extremely conscientious of their faithful devotion to God and making sure that their activities were not leading them into participating in practices that would question their loyalty to Jesus, but instead would live with such integrity that people would know that they were faithful followers of Christ. Or consider it from the perspective of Paul's writings in Galatians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. The law is not based on faith. On the contrary, it says, the person who does these things will live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it is written, "Cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole." He redeems us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. Let's draw parallels then between what Paul is saying here in Galatians and what we've seen said in both Leviticus 18 and Leviticus chapter 20. Paul here is emphasizing in verse 12, much like in, say, Leviticus chapter 18, verse 5, that by obeying the law, by following God's guidelines, by living in a way that's consistent with God's character, by being holy in a way that mirrors the holiness of God, we experience fruitful life in the land. A failure to keep the law results in losing the land and losing meaningful life. So what happens? Christ comes and gives up his life, taking on our curse to redeem us so that we can experience the blessing of Abraham extending to all people through Jesus in faith. So what do we do with the law then? How do we respond to these Old Testament rules that seem to have particular practices in the ancient world that differ from the particular practices of our world? How do we glean principles to apply them? Here's my suggestions. We recognize the cultural and religious practices of the time, such as not planting two kinds of seed in a field, or not wearing fabrics made of two materials, as Leviticus 19:19 prohibits, not eating bloody meat, as Leviticus 19:26 prohibits, not cutting your sideburns, as Leviticus 19 verse 27 prohibits, or getting a tattoo, as Leviticus 19 verse 28 prohibits. But we also recognize the broader and more general intention of these principles, such as being holy like God is holy, being set apart, being different from the world around us, as Leviticus chapter 20 verse 7 states, being set apart from those who do not follow God, as Leviticus 20 verse 24 states, and remaining faithful and loyal to our God, as Leviticus 20 verse 26 encourages us to do. So for me, the general principle of remaining faithful to God and striving to follow his character in the world is universally applicable, whereas the specific ways or practices that people did this in ancient Israel differ from how you and I do it today. So I need to have a spirit of discernment so that I can be able to apply God's character to my own day and practice through the lens of how I see it lived out in the person and teaching of Jesus. Now, why do you think Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 give what seems to be a pretty consistent double standard, prohibiting men but not women from such same-sex acts? There are absolutely no references to female with female sex in Leviticus 18 and 20. Many biblical scholars, such as the Jewish scholar and conservative rabbi Jacob Milgram, suggest that the act of sex outside of procreative purposes is what is condemned or seen as unnatural. As we saw last week when discussing the desired acts of the men of Sodom, dominance and shame were primary motivators for men penetrating others, treating them like women who did not have the same social status or equal rights in their society. It was inhospitality that was really the key in the ancient world. And so we saw that in Genesis, we saw that in Judges, and again, we see that in Leviticus. Thus, what is detestable is to treat another man who is of equal status like a woman of generally inferior status. We might consider how we treat people as inferiors in our own day and time that goes in ways that go beyond the biblical mandates. So instead of getting caught up in the specifics of what's happening in a practice in the ancient world, if the principle is that I need to treat people with dignity and with respect, even beyond societal or cultural or family traditional norms, how can I better exhibit the acceptance and kindness and love of God to people who are different than me? Let's conclude with words from David Gushee in the chapter. He says, quote, "Once Jesus comes along and the church is founded, neither 2,000 years ago nor today has it been as simply as just quoting a passage from Leviticus to settle the matter of Christian morality. It should be noted that the Jewish tradition itself has never simply read Hebrew Bible texts at face value, but instead considered them through a highly sophisticated, mediating body of rabbinic tradition, questioning, and argumentation. It's scandalous how Christians extract ancient texts of the Hebrew Bible, call it our Old Testament, and then interpret them without any reference to the way Jewish biblical interpretation itself has proceeded for over 2 millennia. And so, in conclusion today, I invite you, as we have last week and we will in the coming weeks, to ask yourself, how, if at all, has your understanding of the wrong described in our passage today in Leviticus chapters 18 and 20 changed as a result of this study? And then consider how this impacts your understanding of the Bible's view of gay relationships. And so feel free either to pause the video or after the video concludes to take some time and journal about this, take some time to share with a friend, make an appointment with someone to have coffee and talk about it this week, or to meet there with other family members or friends who have gathered in your home to watch this video and talk about how has this impacted your understanding of how queer theology approaches these passages from Leviticus. Now, if you're continuing to follow along in real time, the next video will not come out next week. I will be out of pocket and unable to record the next session until 2 weeks from today. And at that time, we're going to shift from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And we're going to look primarily at 2 words that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9, and 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10. And so I invite you to go ahead and spend some time in preparation of our next study in 2 weeks to look at those chapters, familiarize yourself with what the background, the context is of what's happening there, and we'll begin to unpack that in our next session. I look forward to seeing you then. God bless.